All right, welcome back. We are sorting with our sortable component. It's all working very well at this point. And what I want to do in this lesson is I want to properly configure and implement our configuration option in our sortable class for the onSort lifecycle event. This is especially important with a sortable because obviously most of the time when you implement a component, you want to do something with the data. Like in this case, we're just like in the page and we're just ordering our favorite food, but it's not like getting submitted anywhere. We're not doing anything with the data. But most of the time, when it's not a silly example like this, you would actually want to do something with the sortable data. And that means we need to get like an array or a JSON object or some sort of data that's going to allow us to figure out what is it that the user actually did with the sortable. And that's why these lifecycle events can be so handy, because they are going to allow us to do that pretty easily inside of our sortable component. And there's lots of different ways you could approach this. You could create a method on the class that builds the data in a very structured way. We could call like a sortable.getData method, and that's going to work just fine. You certainly could do that. But in this case, it's really just, right now, it's just an HTML that we're making sortable. So it's not really bound to any data. So I think what we'll do is just kind of demonstrate this, is we'll implement the onSort lifecycle method. And I'll sort of show you how you could build, just as an example, an array of strings that represent all of the items in our sortable. And that's fairly easy to do. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's just decide that our onSort configuration option, this function or this callback that you could potentially provide, which by default does nothing. Again, it's just curly brackets, doesn't do anything, but you could override that when you're instantiating your sortable. Let's just say that as an example, maybe this would want to, in its signature, provide the state of the sortable to any callbacks that you provide as an option. And that's very typical. When you're creating a component, again, with our toggle, the state was very simple. It was like, is the toggle on or is it off? But in this case, our state has actually gotten quite a bit more complex. We have, what are you currently dragging? What's the dragging index? What's the container and the sortable list elements that you're actually dragging? And if you just pass this whole state object to these lifecycle events on many of your components, that's going to provide quite a bit of data to any other area of your application where you may want to utilize this. So just as an example, let's go ahead and use this state object in our onSort handler, our onSort option. And what we'll do is we'll go down to our sort method, which is the almost at the bottom here. We have our sort method here. And when we're done setting our new dragging index, we will fire the onSort event. And that's going to, just like we did in our toggle, it's going to be this.config.onSort in this case. And this is where we would pass data basically to any callback that is sort of subscribing to this event, if you will. So in this case, I could just simply pass the this.state object, which again contains all that great stuff about what's going on with this sortable. And now that we've done this, it's not going to do anything different by default because it's an empty callback by default. But if in our app.js we were to configure an onSort, we could take that state and then we could pass it to some sort of custom function where, just as an example, we could say console.log state. And then you're going to see in our custom implementation of the sortable, when we've instantiated this, we now are going to get in the console as we move up and down. We're going to get all the data every time it's sorted about what's going on inside of that sortable. And I've released the mouse cursor in this case, so it kind of sets it back to null and undefined. But you'll sort of see in the previews, like where it says dragging element, li.active drag, dragging index 1, 2, 3. When the onSort lifecycle method actually gets executed, it does actually contain data. Like for example, I could say state.dragging index, and you'll see it's simply going to log the position of wherever I moved this every time it sorts. And in this example, if I do want to generate a string of data that is sort of made up of all these strings that are inside of each list item, I could basically go in here and say get sortable data, const items equals new array, and then for let list item of state.sortable list.children. So we can actually iterate over the children of our sortable list state property. which again, that's coming over here. That's this this.state.sortable list. It's the unordered list that contains all of the sortables. So I'm iterating over all of its children, which its children are going to consist of each sortable. And I can, from there, basically say items.push list item.text content. And then if we console.log items, you'll see here in the console, I'm actually going to get an array that contains each item that I've actually had. And it has a space here because technically there's a space before the icon. So we could even do like a .trim. That would work too, to kind of trim that space. But you can sort of collect this data however you want. But either way, it's going to give you a nice sorted list of strings that contains the data that the user has provided. So I can now take this array, I could put it into my application, I could persist it to a database, I could do whatever I want with it. I could submit it with a form, whatever you want to do. You can now utilize this data because you've sort of subscribed to this lifecycle event, and you could do something with it. Like for example, in this case, maybe I want to set the text area down here, our JSON box, JSON text area input box to the value of that array. So just as an example, we could, let's add an ID to that text area. So we'll say ID equals JSON, class equals JSON too, but let's give it a unique ID of JSON to the text area. And now what we can do in our app.js right here is let's update JSON. And we'll say document.getElementById JSON .value is going to be equal to JSON.stringify the items that we generated up here, this array of items, and then let's give it a spacing of 2. If you do comma null, comma 2, you'll see it just generates a nice, very friendly formatted JavaScript array right down here. And now every time I update, you can see the broccoli moving up and down and the JSON down below. It's always going to be up to date with the state of our sortable list, which is up above. And this is great. This is exactly what you generally want to have from any of your components that you build. You need to think about what sort of lifecycle events are going to matter for that component. For the most part, you're going to have some sort of like on update event, because a lot of times a component that you might build might provide some sort of input or value or something like that. Like in this case, the value is the order of the food that we are ranking. And other components in your application may need to know when that value changes. But you could certainly have components where the state is going to change in a different way. And maybe it's not providing a value, maybe it's doing something else. There's lots of different ways to implement these lifecycle events, and it's going to be different based on what it is that you're building. And it's up to you to decide what matters to other developers who are actually implementing this. Cool, so I think that's going to do it for our sortable. This is all the basic functionality you would need to build a sortable component in your own application. However, there's still some ways we can improve this, especially in terms of accessibility and keyboard support. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue to update this and make it even better for visually impaired and keyboard accessible users.